Apple CEO Tim Cook met with Pope Francis at the Vatican. Apple CEO Tim Cook met with Pope Francis at the Vatican on Friday in a brief get-together. The two spoke for about 15 minutes, surrounded by their personal teams and Vatican cameras. Now this is interesting and comes hot off the heels of the Pope meeting with Eric Schmidt, Executive Chairman of Google at the Vatican. And of course, around the same time, the Pope also released the first ever prayer video regarding the coming together of the world's religions, which I talked about in the last broadcast. So the question has to be asked, friends, why would the Vatican want to meet these powerful technology companies? Is the Vatican wanting to use these companies to extend its message across the earth in these last days? It's interesting, friends, because the Vatican's message is sounding more and more political as the days go on, and it's sounding more like an arm of government than a religious institution. It appears to be using its religious power to influence the masses. For example, it was Pope Francis who published the first ever papal encyclical dedicated exclusively to the environment, stating that the environmental crisis is not only a scientific, political and economic problem, but a moral and spiritual challenge as well. Of course, there are many who say climate change is a fabricated crisis, like for example Lord Christopher Monckton, who was the chief science advisor under British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Monckton campaigns tirelessly against it and says it's merely a smokescreen for the globalists to implement world government. But also many scientists question the accuracy of climate projections, such as the British botanist and TV personality David Bellamy. In fact, he said it was his views on climate change that actually ended his TV career. And that, my friends, is again evidence that the government-controlled mainstream media use television to propagate their views to influence us. Also, Harrison Schmitt, geologist and Apollo 17 astronaut, questions climate change too. And there's a whole list of other scientists who question it. And now the Vatican has got behind it and is promoting the climate change crisis too. And of course, Pope Francis made history in the first ever papal address to US Congress back in September of last year, speaking out about embracing the migrants entering the US and Europe. And of course, he's also called for gun control, something the United Nations and the Obama administration are aggressively pushing, which is an affront to the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. And let's remember, friends, that it was Adolf Hitler who set about using gun control when he came to power. To ensure the Jews had no means of resistance, they were finally ordered to surrender their firearms. And then following that, of course, an orchestrated Nazi onslaught against the entire Jewish community happened in Germany. Now, friends, we should also remember that in the closing stages of history, there will be an amalgamation of politics and religion. The Antichrist and the false prophet will work together. And in fact, it is the false prophet who initiates the worship of the Antichrist through the mark of the beast banking system. Now, can you see how all these things are moving in this direction? The religious system of Catholicism accounts for at least 1 billion people on the planet, so the Pope is a key influencing power for the globalists. If you can get the Pope on board, you can make some serious headway in bringing the world a step closer to that new world. And think too that Apple and Google are both key instruments in the creation of the beast system. Google with its surveillancing of the world through Google Earth and its monitoring of the internet and its development of wearable tech devices such as Google Glass, which is set to make a comeback this year. And remember, smart glasses will eventually enable a user to pay for goods. And of course, it was a British company who developed an attachment for Google Glass that sat directly on the forehead, and by the power of thought, a user would be able to pay for things. Does that sound like the prophecy to you? And of course, Apple with its smartwatch too, and we all know where the smartwatches will lead, to an implant in the hand. Now do hear me, friends, I'm not saying the Pope is the false prophet and Obama is the Antichrist. I'm just saying that we can see the spiritual climate of the day is leading directly to the fulfillment of these prophecies. Because friends, these things are gradual, they don't just happen overnight, they have to start somewhere. Now, as I've said before, we should pray for our leaders as the Bible tells us, and we should pray for Obama, and we should pray for the Pope too, as the Spirit leads. Because in many ways, friends, they are pawns in a globalist plan to institute global governance. And as I said last week, that can't be done without a unification of all structures, be they political or spiritual. And just coming back to that original story, friends, maybe this is why the Vatican is meeting Google and Apple bosses, because through that various technologies, they can aid the Vatican in its propagation of its messages to a global audience.